everyone thought I was going to do ham radio for this, but I wanted to go and do something even older. Yeah, just had to turn that volume all the way down.
The origin of the 2x4?
So I wanted to go with something that computers have and ham radios have that's even older and hundreds of years older, and something that's required for all computing to work. So what could that be? Well, I had a friend 3D print a few pieces, and I couldn't get all of the pieces because we all got sheltered, or we all had to go in quarantine. So I got the important parts. So the thing that every computer has in common, even with ham radios and all of computing, is a clock. And some of you know I like mechanical clocks. So here I have the makings of an escapement. And I have hammered this onto a 2x4 because the other pieces couldn't quite get done in time. But anyway, ingenuity. So in a clock, let me actually just rip this piece off. In a clock, we have a power source that wants to just spin gears around. So this, in a really old clock, could be a weight that is like wrapped around this spindle and it just falls down. But that would be a pretty useless clock if it just fell straight to the ground, right? Or if there was a spring over here that was providing some torque on here, that would be pretty bad. So we have to slow it down. And that's where this little pallet fork comes in. Hold on, I'm going to hammer something. So now what we get is, now if we can get in really close, hopefully this works, we can see that the teeth of the little escape wheel here and the pallet fork, there's a slight angle to them. That's because when this spins, it just gives a little nudge to the pallet fork. And that's what throws it to lock in place. So here, I'll do that again. So we're about here, and it throws it. And then the same happens down at the bottom. It is similarly angled. So then we get another little nudge, and then we have a repeating process. And if everything's in balance, we just get slight little nudges that make this wobble back and forth. So that's cool, right? We can get this and we can have it stop in place. But if it gets stuck like this, I'm applying force. That's not going to work. So we need something that will whack this back, and then whack this back, and back, and back, and back. And in a big clock like Big Ben, that's the big pendulum. So a big pendulum swings down here, and it just knocks this back and forth. Now, in a wristwatch, we can't fit a big pendulum. So that's where this piece comes in. This is a big old balance wheel. And yes, these are nails that have been filed down, so that one's not as sharp. So in a regular wristwatch, this would oscillate back and forth, and we'd have different weights on the outside to either make it heavier and slower in its motion, or we can bring the weights in, make it faster, remove them, make it faster, and in here would be a spring that we couldn't quite print in time. So let's nudge that in to see the whole thing come together. Oops. One second, a hammer. Gotta love the physical demos. So now, when this applies pressure can't really feel the torque. This is why I wanted to be in person, but oh well. This will throw that balance wheel, force it to lock, and then the balance wheel would swing back the other way, and I'm applying force to the escape wheel, and we're going back and forth. And this is how we regulate, oh, my nail came out. That's how we regulate a watch. Make it go faster, make it go slower. So if it's not keeping good time, you just need to dig in and mess with your balance wheel, which is what we pay a lot of watchmakers to do for us. Now, when the watch gets a little weak, when there's a lot less power on this side, this mechanism will automatically stop where it just can't push the pallet fork out of the way. So then when we wind our watch later, then it can start moving that out of the way, and we can get our ticking back and forth. And if we hold a mechanical watch up to our ears, this is what we hear. This is happening on a modern mechanical watch about 28,000 times per second, or per hour, sorry. So that's quite a bit of ticks back and forth. That's why it sounds really fast. I wanted to have a mechanical watch to pass around, but, well, we're all at home. Any questions on the mechanical watch? I think I got my audio back working.
Yep.
Awesome. So yeah, there's my old tech. Ticking back and forth.
You gonna build the rest of the clock?
So a friend of mine has the 3D printer. I do not. So when quarantine ends, I might have a fun desk toy.
What causes that large wheel to oscillate back and forth? You said there's a spring in there. Is the spring what's causing that?
Yeah, so inside of here, there would be a spring that when it goes too far, the spring expands, and then it'll contract, and then it'll expand again. It's a big coil. So if you throw it in either direction, it wants to go back to its resting state.
Right.
But yeah.
Cool.
And that's keeping everything in balance is really hard with mechanical watches. Like if you drop your watch or something, it's going to skip a beat. And this is literally what it's happening. Like it's this oscillation doesn't quite happen. So it just kind of doesn't make a full amplitude, and it just kind of goes like this, right? That's skipping a beat. So you're losing some power, and your seconds hand didn't tick. Because everything outside of this escape wheel is just gearing. So the seconds hand is almost attached directly to this, moving very small increments. And your hour hand obviously goes even slower. But yeah.
So George, question, not sure if it's a fair question. What is the analogous part in an electronic clock to the escapement system?
Great question. So in a quartz watch, so I'm actually wearing a quartz watch just to have some time difference. Anyway, you have a battery that's pumping electricity through a small little piece of quartz that vibrates just the same way as this is oscillating, but it vibrates many thousand times per second, whereas this mechanism does 4 beats per second. So that's why quartz watches are more accurate, because when a beat is skipped on a mechanical watch, you've skipped a quarter second or an eighth of a second, because it's actually times 2. Whereas with quartz, if there's 14,000, I think, I can't remember, and you skip one, no one's going to notice. So that's why those will have something like a couple seconds a month, maybe drift, maybe. The most accurate watch, I think, today that's not a cesium clock, because that's millions of oscillations per second, is something like a second a year. So, yeah. I like keeping time. There's one other fun thing that I also forgot about. This same idea of an escapement where it's taking some kind of a power and limiting how far it can move is also what makes this on the typewriter move just a little bit. Same idea. Who's next? Unless there are any other questions.
When you talk about really old tech, how old are we actually talking about?
The rule for this event was before your 10th birthday. And let's see, this escapement is 1379. It was first invented. It's changed a little bit over time, but so I went back a few hundred years. But really, no one's going to check your birthday, so whatever.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Thank you for sharing.
Cool, thanks. Who's next?
I'll go, George, if you want.
All right, thanks.
All right, let me just share the right screen here. All right, let me know if that's coming through.
Yeah, looks good.
All right, cool. So, yeah, I was trying to think of what I wanted to do, and I find some of this old computer history kind of fascinating because it explains why some things work the way they do even today. So I'm going to do something on punch cards and sort of unit record equipment, and I actually used to use some of this stuff way back when I first started my career, so I actually have some hands-on experience that I can share. So next slide here. All right, so the first one of these things, really the origin of this, is Jacquard loom, which was developed back in 1725, and actually originally used sort of a paper tape, but you can kind of see the paper tape here that's being used to control the loom. Later on, this found its way into what was probably what most people recognize, and that's the 1890 census. And the device that's here is actually it's a sort of a recreation of Hollerith's first device that they were using for the census. And there's an example of what one of the original cards looked like as well that they used for this. And there's like a pantograph that's here that's used to actually read the holes in the individual cards that they came through. Essentially, what's up here, all these dials, are essentially just counters. So they would place the card into sort of a reading station, move the pantograph across these different holes, and that would cause these various counters to increment. So they could, count how many people were in a certain district, or maybe gender, things like that. And so that's actually one of the first uses of sort of a punch card, because they found the cards were more durable than the paper tape. And reduced the time to process the data for the sentences. It took them 8 years to do this in 1880, and they got it down to 6 years, despite the fact that they had a lot more returns in 1890. And that kind of launched Hollerith's sort of career. And so he founded this company called the Tabulating Machine Company in 1896. And there were several other companies that got into this business of making these tabulating machines. They kind of merged together to form this company called Computing, Tabulating, and Recording Company back in 1911. And after some years of success with that, they renamed the company to International Business Machines, or IBM, back in 1924. So this is really how IBM got its start. And in fact, early days of IBM, probably the first 20 or so years of IBM were largely focused on tabulating machines. And it wasn't really until after the Second World War when Thomas Watson's son was trying to convince him that these computers were going to be the future. He was not really convinced of this, and they sort of launched some internal projects. But IBM was actually a little bit behind the curve in getting into computers after the Second World War, and of course in the 1950s they became a lot more dominant. That's kind of the start of IBM. The cards themselves, I found this was kind of interesting. In 1890, the cards were 3 by 5.5 inches, and that's what Hollerith came up with. And there were 12 rows with 24 columns. So if we go back to this is kind of the layout of the original card. And over time, the card was standardized to the cards that, if you've seen a punch card more recently, 3¼ by 7�3/8. And I always wondered why they chose that size. And it turns out that was the same size as U.S. currency as it was used from 1862 to 1923. So that's the reason the cards were that size. And then IBM looked at those cards and said, gee, we really want to cram some more data into these cards. So they launched some internal project to try to figure out how they could put more data on the card. And they came up with a standard of 12 rows by 80 columns in 1928. And that included the switch to rectangular holes. So before that, they were using circular holes. And that actually, in order to fit 80 columns on a card that was 7�3/8 inches wide, they had to switch to the rectangular holes that you see now. I think when they originally came up with this approach too, they came up with an encoding scheme that didn't require them to have more than 3 holes per column, because you put too many holes in a card in a given space, it weakens the integrity of the card itself, and they'd have read errors and stuff like that. By 1964, IBM introduced something called EBCDIC, which, if you worked on the mainframe, very familiar with this. This is the IBM equivalent of ASCII, and was quite a nemesis for me for many years, moving data back and forth between the mainframe and the PC, because we'd have to do these data conversions from EBCDIC to ASCII and back and forth. And part of the reason for EBCDIC was because it was designed to be punched on cards. And as I understand, it was a more efficient coding scheme and worked better on punch cards than ASCII did, or at least that's IBM's official reason why they chose to use EBCDIC over ASCII. An interesting thing here is we've all been familiar with the 80-column terminal display, right? And you always wonder, why were these displays 80 columns? Why weren't they 100 or, or 75 or something like that? And it's because the cards were 12 rows by 80 columns. So if you ever wonder why a terminal, at least the older character mode terminal, was 80 columns, that's the reason. And in fact, this terminal that you're seeing here is an IBM 3278. This is actually the exact type of terminal that I used when I first was programming professionally. And they were like basically made out of metal. They were really, really heavy duty machines. They probably would last 50 years, even though from a technology perspective, they were obsolete pretty quickly. But that's the origin of the 80-column display. So that kind of explains a little bit why we have 80-column displays, and also why the cards were the size that they were based on currency. The way the cards are laid out, this is sort of a modern punch card. You can see up here we have these unprinted regions up here, right? From here we have 0 to 9, but up here we have sort of 3 rows here in which we can encode things. And this controls the type of information that the bottom row represents. So you can see we have these holes punched in the top here. That basically tells it that we're going to print alpha characters. You can see that we've got an A, B, C, D up here and represented by these holes down here. Notice those same positions generate numbers because there's nothing punched in that upper zone here. Then once we run out of letters here, because we've used all 9 positions, we shift to the next zone down here, which gives us some of the remaining characters in the alphabet. So by using various combinations of these upper zones and the punched holes in the bottom, that's actually what generates the full character set. Punching the cards themselves, this is an IBM 029 key punch machine. Was introduced in 1964. So there were key punch machines that existed prior to this, but this is probably one of the most modern ones, and one that you probably would most likely see. And this is actually one of the ones that I originally used back in college when we had way too many people and too few terminals. So we still had a bunch of these 029 key punch machines, and for one class I took, we actually had to do all of the coursework on a key punch machine. And up here in this part of the machine here is the hopper where you put all the blank cards in. The cards drop down over here, so the card will be facing you. And I have a YouTube video in a moment that'll show some of this. And the cards will go into this punching station. The punch is actually behind here. And as you start typing on the keyboard here, it'll start punching the proper holes in the card. When you're done with the card, you hit a key on the keyboard, the card will move from the punching station over here to the reading station. and the next card will drop down into the punching station, so you can go ahead and punch the next card. Now you might wonder, well, what happens if you make a mistake, right? If you strike the wrong character on the card, there's no way to white space a hole, right? If you got a hole, if you punched a hole in the wrong place in the card's scrap. However, it would be tedious to have to go, maybe you've messed up on column 75. It would be tedious to have to retype the entire card. So these machines had a dupe key on them. And what you would do is, remember I mentioned there was a reading station here. So your bad card is sitting in the reading station right now. You could hit the dupe key, and if you messed up column 75, you could dupe all the way to column 74 and then punch the rest of the card correctly. So that's how corrections were actually made. Then you discard the scrap card. When the cards were completely punched, they would rotate. They'd be facing you here, and then they'd rotate up into this hopper here. So it's kind of a U-shaped path that the cards move through. And these particular machines, the 029, where they were transistorized machines, remember a friend of mine in college, he used them in high school. I think it was the 026, it was an earlier version. They had vacuum tubes in them, so you actually had to turn the machine on, let it warm up for a while before you could actually use it. Underneath this cover swings up. There's a program drum inside here. You can see this window that kind of shows the drum, and I'll show you what the program drum does in a moment. But essentially, it controls where on the card you can punch characters and what characters can be punched in those zones. So this was important if you ever, well, years ago, I remember getting telephone bills, and along with the bill came a punched card, and you were supposed to return the card along with your check back to, say, the telephone company. When the material would arrive at the telephone company office, someone would open up the envelope. They would put your card into the punching station here, but they had a program mounted on the drum here that would cause the card to advance to a specific spot on the card where they would key the amount that you had remitted, right? So if you sent them a check for $25, they would key in $25. Earlier on in columns earlier in the card would have already been pre-punched your phone number or your account number. And then those would, of course, go into the station here. They'd gather up the deck of cards and then do a batch processing run to post updates to the account. So this was really common in the 60s and 70s. You would get bills that way, typically with some kind of a punch card in it. We'll see if the YouTube video plays here or not. I have no idea how this is going to work over Zoom. Let's see let me see if I can get him to drop cards. Here he is punching some cards. And you can see it going into the reading station here. You can see how the cards flipped up there. So,
that's cool.
well, I don't need to go through the rest of the video, but I just wanted to show you kind of how the machine works. And then in the next slide here, we have the program drum. So you would actually punch a card and control what fields you wanted the operator to be able to place values in. And then you would wrap it around this drum with these clamping strips, open that door that I told you was on the 029, mount that onto the drum, and then you could control where they could type. And so people wouldn't punch stuff in the wrong columns or punch alpha characters where they were just supposed to put numerics, stuff like that. So that is some early technology. Later on, this gave way to something called key-to-tape machines. So when I worked at Kodak, we had a bunch of people who did this. Actually, we had a key punch machine, but we also had these Entrex machines, and orders would come in from the shop floor. Someone would key this in on a terminal, and there could be a network of these, like several terminals in a room. The what was essentially a mini computer running in this box would take all of that and write that card input to tape. When we wrote the mainframe programs, we had something called job control language. It was just basically controlled all the input and output file specs for all of the jobs that ran on the mainframe. We could control where that input came from. So we could say, hey, I want to pull this from a card reader, or I want to pull it from magnetic tape. So some programs that were written back in the 60s that were designed originally to take physical card input, just through the JCL, we could tell it to pull that data in off a tape instead, and it would read it as though it was reading stuff off of a card reader. Then eventually, obviously, over time, this stuff went away to like online transaction processing, CICS, and stuff like that. But for many years, a lot of these old systems, even when they were moving inventory around in the warehouses and stuff, physical cards would travel with that inventory, and when they moved it to another location, they pull the card and basically punch the location on that card and then feed it into a system, and that's how the inventory was actually managed. So kind of like a really old version of a QR code in a way. And that's pretty much all I have. There's a lot more I could talk about with unit record equipment and stuff like that, but I just thought some of this old history of punch cards was kind of interesting. And that's it for me.
That's cool.
Yeah, very cool question though. You said that the card size was determined by the currency, but
Right.
The question is why? I mean, what's the connection between currency and card size?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the reason was, but I think it was because there was already a lot of material handling equipment that was designed to support that currency, right, size. Think about envelopes and other equipment that was used to process that.
Oh my God, I could mail a program with paper.
Well, the problem is each one of these cards is one row, right? One line
Right.
of text. So they came in boxes. There were 2,000 cards in a box. So I remember, writing programs and punching decks of cards. And obviously you can imagine there's a lot of problems with this, because if you drop the box of cards, you got a little bit of a problem. So typically what we would do is punch up the deck of cards, feed that in, get the program into the machine. And then they supported an editing language, kind of just like almost like a regex replace, right? You would tell it what line number you wanted to change, what the old string was, what the new string was, and you could go ahead and do that kind of changing. So you wouldn't have to keep feeding the entire deck of cards into the to update your source code. You wouldn't have to do that every single time. And in fact, even later on, we were running into problems where there was just so much contention for people to get on those terminals on this mainframe that we had. And people would sign up on sign-up sheets. It would take a better part of a day to even get some time, only to fix, a missing semicolon or something like that you had in your code. I mean, some really simple edit. So for those of us who still knew how to operate the key punches, I could go to that room. There was like nobody in there. It was like a ghost town. Could punch up a small deck of cards, maybe just a half dozen cards, feed them into the batch system, and it would update my source code and then rerun the job again. And that might save me a whole lot of time if I just have a couple of edits that I have to.
Yeah, but there were also lots of people who couldn't afford to have the disk storage for their program or more likely their data. So there were lots of grad students carrying lots of boxes of cards, and occasionally someone would spill it, and you'd hear this anguished soul scream.
Yeah. Or the worst part was some of those 029s we had were pretty old, and we had registration error problems. So the machine we were using was a Burroughs mainframe, and it had a Burroughs card reader on it. And the card reader sometimes would reject your cards if they weren't punched exactly in the right spots. So, there were physical alignment issues sometimes. There was nothing more frustrating than punching up a bunch of cards, bringing them in there. They'd run them through the reader, and the reader would reject all the cards. It was just really frustrating.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Pete.
So this is, be thankful for VS Code is basically all I can say.
Yeah, right. I'd rather work on watch escapements.
Yeah, kind of. It's so strange, though, that when you work with this stuff, people don't don't think that it was really all that odd, right? In the beginning, when before they didn't have terminals and stuff, this was the way that stuff was done. So when I first started at Kodak, they even told me we had terminals. That was like a new thing, that we had terminals to use, and they told me, oh, if you don't want to type all the code in, you can fill it out on these coding sheets. They were physical pieces of paper that had little boxes that you could basically write in what you wanted in every column on the card. I could hand it to a lady who was a remote job entry person. She would key the whole thing for me. So we basically had a key punch machine and a card reader in a remote location that was hooked up to a modem that transmitted the stuff across the Elm Grove campus down to the mainframe, which was building 2. And you know, did that for a little while, but her job didn't last very long, right? Because we all were pretty comfortable with using the terminals, and they just found something else for her to do down the road. But it was kind of funny how, you know, I thought, starting there already, I was quite comfortable using a keyboard, but it was really kind of amusing. Some of the people who had been there for a long time, this was how they were doing everything. They did not sit in front of a terminal and key stuff. They had someone else do it.
Huh.
Well, also in the days of cards, there were I don't know about Kodak since I didn't work there then, but there were lots of places where you were limited in the number of runs that you would have in a day.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you would have
Very
maybe
true.
2 runs.
Yes.
And in between, you went back and desk checked your code, because what else were you going to do?
Yeah, you didn't want to make mistakes, because if you screwed it up, the whole job would run. It would reject, the code. You'd have syntax errors. So we spent a lot of time desk checking code. Now, here's something really horribly inefficient. When I worked at Kodak, we had budgets for every little project we worked on, and we were billed back on computer time for even a compile cost money, right, to submit the job and run it. It cost money to do that. So we had to estimate our labor hours and our computer dollars. And I remember desk checking code for syntax errors, because I didn't want to submit the code through a rather lengthy compile step, because it was going to cost me too many computer dollars. So I would waste human hours or minutes looking through stuff by hand. Today it's ridiculous, right? We would use a linter or whatever to do that. But we did a lot of really inefficient things, because people were relatively cheap relative to the, what it costs to run stuff on the computer. It's kind of nuts by today's standards.
Yeah, but it wasn't even just a run. I mean, it was broken up into lots of separate charges. You had separate charges for main memory usage and for disk usage and for the number of pages that you printed out. I mean, there were just a lot of different things that went into those charges.
Yes. Yep. And so, it caused you to do things that today would seem horribly inefficient. But it was all, to try to save money, or, gee, I'm under on labor hours, but I'm over on computer dollars. So I'm going to spend more labor hours now so that I can still bring this thing in within budget. It was just kind of nuts. Thankfully, that stuff kind of died away eventually.
All right. Man, I feel like we could talk about punch cards forever.
Yeah, I'm well past my 5 minutes, and actually we'll well beyond punch cards too. So.
I see 2 Joshes. Does that mean Josh is ready to go next?
Yeah, I can. I've got a few slides, and then I have a little demo that I'm ready to film on my phone.
All right, run it.
There we go. Okay, so I was always fascinated when I would visit my grandmother's house. She had a record player cabinet in the basement, and it belonged to her mother-in-law, my grandfather's mother, and my dad would always go over to her house and play with it. And so it was my dad's, but my grandmother had it. And about a year ago, I acquired it. My grandmother and my father let me take it to my house. So I've been playing around with it and sharing a little bit about the stuff that the technology behind that. So the basic idea is that you want to record sound by the air vibrates, it vibrates a needle, and you're cutting that vibration pattern physically into a medium. And this actually came before the playback. So the first recording was actually recorded onto paper that wasn't ever able to be played back until like 10 or 15 years ago, when they scanned it into a computer and recreated the sound that generated those vibrations. And then with playback, you run a needle along that groove that you created that recreates those vibrations that originally caused that groove, and then somehow amplify that vibration so that it's loud enough to actually hear. So this is an electron microscope view of some record grooves and a record needle. I think that these are much smaller grooves than the grooves that I have on my machine from the 1920s, I believe. So initially, the first recordings that could be played back were in these cylinders. I believe they were wax cylinders, and you can see the grooves along the side, and the cylinder would rotate, spin, and the needle would move along that groove. But these were not very efficient to store. There's a lot of wasted space inside that cylinder. And so the next step was what we think of today as a record. So these were on a shellac material, which shatters a lot more easily than vinyl. And they spun at 78 rotations per minute. In the 1950s, you moved into a 33 rotation per minute vinyl disc. Vinyl does not shatter as easily as shellac, and the 33 rotations per minute meant that it spun a lot slower, which meant that you could fit a lot more audio into the disc. If we look back at the 78, you'll notice that the grooves are kind of consistent throughout the whole length of the record, whereas on here you've got these darker rings, and those rings indicate the separation between songs. So you could store, these were called like long play LP records, and you could get half an album onto one of these, which is why an album is like 10 or 12 songs, because on both sides of the vinyl record you could fit that much audio. On these you get one song per side, so 2 to 3 minutes of audio per side. And then with the 33 RPM vinyl discs, that was around the time that electronic amplification started to be a thing. With the 78 RPM discs, the amplification of that vibration from the needle was basically entirely mechanical, just large cavities that become larger and larger to help funnel the air into making more noise. So because you need this big space to provide that audio amplification physically instead of electronically, it needed to be fairly large, and so it was very common for that to be contained within a piece of furniture that would not look unsightly in your living room. So these are just some examples of some of the different form factors. You can see on this one on the right, it has Victrola written on there. Victrola, RCA is a company that I believe still exists in one form or another today, or at least did 15 or 20 years ago. And they got their start making these talking machines, and the Victrola was their phonograph product. As I was growing up and as my dad was growing up, they always referred to this record player that I now have as the Victrola. And it wasn't until I got it in my house about a year ago that I realized that it is not actually Victrola. Victrola is the brand name of the phonograph talking machine that was made by RCA, but this is actually made by Adler, another company. And so this is an Adler talking machine. So it's the Royal Adler Antique Crank Phonograph. So some close-up shots of the device that I have sitting next to me in my living room. So here it is here. It is crank powered. So you turn this crank and you can get about one and a half songs worth of time if you crank it all the way. This other control is the volume adjuster. So if you push it in, it dampens the audio. and it comes out quieter. If you pull it out all the way, it dampens it less and you get a louder sound coming out. If you open the top, you've got these two separate doors. On the left, you have just like a storage area, and on the right is the turntable. Is my mouse visible? I think
Yes.
my mouse.
Yes, it
Okay.
is. It is.
Okay, good. Since I'm just sharing one window, I wasn't sure. So this right here is the brake. So if you flip that to the right, it will stop the tray from turning. You can crank it before you start playing the song, and the table won't spin. You've got some cups for some used needles, and here is the playing arm. In the front, on the left, you've got some storage for some records. The right is where the audio comes out, and you can actually take out this this cover, and there's nothing really complex behind it. It's really just this this flute, this opening that serves to amplify the audio coming from the needle. Here's the playing head. So you've got the needle here, and it connects to this arm that moves this diaphragm. So this diaphragm vibrates with the needle, and that causes the pressure inside this ring to vibrate with as the sound wave should vibrate, and that air travels along this hollow metal tube as it gets larger and larger, and then down into this cabinet opening. Oh, and there's a close-up. Royal, the perfect phonograph.
Is that a steel needle?
Yeah, so there are a couple different types of needles that I have. I have soft tone and loud tone, and I forget what the two different materials are. One is steel. One is much, much lighter than the other, and so if you want it to be really loud, you get the stiffer, heavier needles. And if like the kids are sleeping and you want to play some music at a quieter volume, you can use the smaller, thinner needles. You also have a speed adjustment there. It spins at 78 RPM, but I imagine everyone has some preferences, or maybe certain records recommend that you spin faster or slower. I'm not totally sure. You can definitely hear a difference from all the way slow to all the way fast.
I'm sure there's some variability in that
Exactly.
78, right? Like 78.5 or something.
Yeah, and as you've owned it for a few years, or if you crank it harder, or like crank it more, maybe it'll spin faster, and you want to twiddle that as you use down your crankness. Okay. So that is the end of my slides, and then I figured that I would just briefly start playing a record. So I'm going to switch over to my phone. All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Oh, and that's my face. There we go. Okay, so here is my phonograph. So let's crank it up a bit. Oh, the brake. I don't have the brake fully engaged. Let's crank that up, turn the volume up. And I just put a fresh needle in. And tried that out. Okay, so I'm here also. This is an arm to prevent the head from going over too much farther. So let's get this spinning. So I'll turn the speed knob all the way fast, and then I'll turn it all the way slow. Back in the middle. All right. And if you close the lid, the audio quality gets a lot better. You hear a lot less of the scratches from the record. So I'll turn that down a little bit. My father found a bunch of boxes of records. My wife's a little unhappy with how disorganized these are, but you can get some 78 records, big bundles of them for very cheap at auctions, and so I'm stocked up for quite a while.
You don't have toilet paper, but you got that.
Exactly. Yep.
Don't need power to listen to the records either.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I turned it on right before the presentation to make sure that it would still work, but there's not much that can go wrong with this.
So how many plays do you get out of a record? I mean, given that you're using metal needles and it's shellac, it seems like there's a fair amount of wear on that.
Yeah. So the needle is designed so that the needle wears down instead of the record. So the recommended number of plays per needle is actually only like 2 or 3 plays at most. And beyond that, the point of the needle gets gets rounded a bit, and that's the point at which you can start to damage the record. I'm sure that there is some damage to the record as well every time that you play, but the idea is that you replace the needles frequently enough, and there's less damage.
Josh, is it easy enough for you to get new needles? I mean, how hard is it to find those?
Yeah, there's a website that is run by, I think, someone in the Albany area, somewhere in New York State, and they have they have a website where they list products, and then you call them and read your credit card number over the phone to them. It was not too difficult for me to find, but in 10 years from now, or 15 years, who knows how easy those will be to find.
Yeah.
So I have some envelopes full of needles here. Those are my loud ones, and these are my quiet ones. And then I've been disposing of my used up ones in here. And it ran out of juice. I didn't crank it hard enough.
That's cool.
That is really cool.
Very cool. Thank you.
I'm just actually going to paste something into the chat. A video that I had come across not too long ago. It talks about the format wars. In 1949, there was a format war between RCA for the 45 RPM record and Columbia for the LP records. So it talks about those early LP records and why that speed was chosen and the switch over from the shellac to vinyl-based records and stuff like that. It's pretty good. The Techmoan guy, he's got a lot of really good videos on old audio and video technologies.
That's cool. Yeah, I've watched some Technology Connections. Is another channel that does that. But
yeah. They're very similar in that way, but I just found it was really interesting because we're all a lot of people are familiar with like the VHS versus beta type of stuff, but it was interesting to hear this one going on right after the Second World War, where RCA was afraid they were going to get outgunned by Columbia, and RCA was pushing 45 RPM records. And we always hear that term album. And I've always, kind of thought of an album as being a single record. And I found out that the term albums, and I think this came from Technology Connections somewhere. There was one that he had done. The idea was with those 78 RPM records, there really was a book of related records that were stored in something that was like a photo album. Yeah, exactly. Those. So that's really where the term album comes from, this collection of discs, basically. And then they eventually managed to fit all of those onto one disc, which was the LP.
Interesting.
That makes sense with photo albums, right?
Right, exactly.